Hi everybody, this is our second lecture on the scientific method. And so we'll be extending some of what we talked about in the first lecture in this lecture. And as I mentioned before is sometimes students have told me that they like shorter lectures. What I'll say is that you're in total control of the length of the lectures in terms of how much you watch at a certain time. So if you want to take a break or want to break up watching a lecture, it's certainly up to you. And in this class, probably more than other classes, there's more sort of like this piece of information, that piece of information. It doesn't tend to be a big major theme that goes throughout the lecture. So it gives you a little bit more opportunity to stop the lecture at some points and take a break if you want to do that. So we already talked a little bit about this in terms of the process of scientific research. And so, this is a relatively old model going back thousands of years. It's probably at least hundreds of years that goes into thousands of years. And so there's always this idea that you might informally observe something, or there might be a practical problem that you want to solve, and that generates research questions. But in reality, for most scientists, the research questions come from previous research or theory that's out there. But that's what they talk about at the beginning. Sometimes it starts with informal observations or practical problems. So you generate research questions. Those research questions are fairly general as you start out. And then we talked about that the next step for you, so your first step was the research questions, which was part of lab exercise number 1. And then we talked about the next step will be doing your annotated bibliography, which will be the first part of your research review, so your lit review. So you go and read the literature on previous research. Sometimes there's theoretical articles, but a lot of it is previous research on your general research question. You read that stuff. You might revise your research question. That's why there's those two arrows there, one going towards the literature review and one coming back to the research questions. So you might revise your research question a bit after you read the literature. We talked about that after you read the literature, you're probably going to have a much more specific hypothesis. So the research question is fairly general. You're going to be reading the literature based on your research question. That helps guide what you want to read. And then based on the readings, you're going to actually come up with more specific hypotheses. And so once you have those specific hypotheses, you design your empirical study. So you design your study. How are you going to measure things? Are you going to have an experiment? Or are you going to do an observational study? Are you going to use self-reports? So how are you going to get your data? And also you think about who you're going to get your data from, of course, too. And then once you have your data, you analyze your data. And then after you analyze your data, you have to interpret your data. And it's important to interpret your data and give it some meaning, because data are meaningless just in and of themselves. It doesn't matter if something's correlated with something else unless you have a theoretical explanation about why that's the case. So why do narcissists have more aggression versus non-narcissists, for example? And then we then extend our study's conclusions to those larger research questions that we started out with. So our study then informs the research literature. So there's an arrow there. So it's pretty much a never-ending cycle, if you will. We use previous theory and research to generate research questions. We conduct specific studies based on those research questions. We get specific data from our sample, and we do our inferential statistics, and we make conclusions about the population. We interpret the meaning of those data, of those statistical findings within our study, and those interpretations then informed a larger research literature. So there's that cycle in the process of scientific research. And we already talked a little bit about this in terms of generating research questions. So again, research questions are general. They're in their simplest form, they're a statement of the relationship between two variables. Are narcissists more aggressive than non-narcissists, or is narcissism related to aggression? Or I had that other example, does eating ice cream make you happy? Or does eating ice cream make people happy? I think we should be more general than just you. So it's just a simple relationship between variables. And we generate these research questions sometimes from informal observations and practical problems. So when we talk about science, they often say those types of things. But in reality, most research generates the research questions from previous research. Usually you don't observe something out of the blue or there's a new practical problem that you see. It can happen, but in general, people have asked those types of questions before. So you usually want to look at previous research to generate these research questions. And then for this class, we're going to be doing generation of research questions, or have done the generation of research questions simply by looking at the data sets that we have. So within one of those data sets that we have, are there a few variables that you're curious about whether they're related to each other? So it's really more about that sort of curiosity about existing data. So we're actually doing this generation of research questions. It's called secondary data analysis. So what you're going to be doing for your research projects in this class is called secondary data analysis, which means somebody else collected the data, but the data are fairly broad enough that you can ask new questions. You can generate new research questions. Probably the only exception to that in our choices for this class is the job candidate study. That one has just a few variables, and there's only really one thing you can ask about those variables. But the other three studies, it's wide open. It's up to your creativity and your interest to generate those research questions. And basically, when you're going to be doing your annotated bibliography, you're going to be using your general research questions to drive your search for articles related to your research question. And what I'll say is what you want to do is you want an approach where you are looking for studies, but those studies talk about a theory that connects the variables. So explains why narcissists are more aggressive than other people, for example. Because what you don't want is you just don't want a bunch of small studies. A really bad lit review is one that just kind of says, oh, here's a bunch of studies and they found that narcissism relates to aggression, period. That's really not going to help your study. So let's say you did a study and that's all you said in your introduction. You're going to get your data and you're either going to say, oh, yeah, I found a relationship too, just like everybody else, or I didn't find a relationship. But there's nothing else to say. So what you want is you want to look for those theoretical conceptual arguments that relate the variables together, because that will help you interpret your data, give meaning to your data, say what's going on. That is good research. Just talking about the relationship between things statistically, that's really bad research. It's really a waste of time and money. So when you're reading previous research, definitely look for research that talks about those theoretical conceptual ideas. And that's what's going to make up the bulk of your introduction, which is the first part of your research paper in this class. So we just talked about the literature review. So again, your annotated bibliography is going to be the first part of that for this class. And that the search for articles is going to be guided by your research question. And when you're reading the articles, it's important to keep in mind what you want to get out of that task. So I already mentioned at the bottom here is that you want to read not just for the findings of the studies, because if you just add those together, it's just a small study, small study, small study. What you're looking for is you're looking for theoretical ideas, conceptual ideas that link the two variables together. And that's actually your real argument about the introduction. A good introduction is one that says, hey, this is why narcissism relates to aggression, and here's some studies that support it. A really bad introduction would be one that, oh, look at study 1, they found narcissism relates to aggression. Study 2 found the same thing. Study 3 found the same thing, but there's no conceptual arguments there. That's a real boring introduction. It's not really useful. So it's those conceptual ideas that you really want to look for. And then as you're reading your lit review, your articles, you also want to think about, it says here, refine your research question. Really, probably what you're really doing is thinking about specifying your hypotheses, which is on the bottom there, because that's actually the last part of your introduction is your specific hypotheses. So you might refine your question a little bit, but certainly what you're thinking of is you're thinking about specific hypotheses about how the variables relate to each other. And so when you also read your literature, you want to focus on the variables within a larger question. So what do I mean by that? So if I say I'm interested in narcissism relating to aggression, well, I better be reading and understanding what narcissism really means. So how do I really define that variable of narcissism? What does that mean? And be able to write that in your introduction so other people know what you mean by narcissism. And then aggression, same thing. So if I say that it's related to aggression, I better be able to specify what I mean by aggression. What does that mean? So to get a good understanding of your variables is a part of the literature review. Oftentimes we have a sort of naive, common sense understanding of these variables when we start, but we want to have a more scientific, psychological understanding of those concepts and constructs. And so reading the literature will help you gain those things. The third point here is what I've already talked about, which is a big emphasis, is looking for those conceptual theoretical arguments about why and how the variables are related to each other. Also, when you're doing constructing a new study, is you're reading the literature to see about possible methodological approaches and measures. That's not going to be a big part of your project because we're going to be using data that's already collected. However, we're going to be having some lab exercises where I'm going to ask you to design, for example, an experiment based on your larger study. You won't be doing the experiment, but you'll be designing the experiment. So while you're reading the literature, you should be looking out about, well, this research question, did some people do experimental research on it, or did they do observational research on it, or did they use questionnaires? How did they approach this question in terms of their actual studies and methodology? And what measures did they use? So knowing those things normally will help you develop your own study. But for this class, it will actually help you with lab exercises where I'll ask you to design your own studies, but not conduct them because we don't have time to do that. We'll be using the already collected data for your papers. And I also mentioned that developing your specific hypotheses is an important part of the literature review. So literature review should help you focus. And so if you remember, I mentioned earlier in another video that at the start of research, everybody feels a little bit uncertain and ambiguous because it's something new. We're not quite sure where we want to go. So don't worry about that. So when you're starting your research project for this class, it's certainly fine to feel like I'm not quite sure what I want to do and I'm a little bit general and a little bit vague. That's fine because everybody starts at that point. Then what happens is when you read the literature, you become more focused in your ideas and what you want to do for your research project. And so just know that as we go on step by step in this class, you're going to have a clearer focus. But when you start something new, when you start a new research project, it's always general and vague. And you just have to learn how to tolerate that, knowing that when you start reading things, it'll become clearer to you. And when you're reading the articles, it's important to keep in mind different types of articles. I hope that most of your articles will be what's called empirical articles. What does that mean? So empirical, it means research. Somebody has designed a study, has conducted measures that give you empirical data that are analyzed by statistics, etc. And so in terms of an empirical article, for this class, it's really important to focus on two parts of the article. So if you have an empirical article, the most important parts are the introduction and the discussion. The introduction is the first part, and the discussion is the last part. So I'll go over the parts of the article real quickly. Empirical articles will start out with the introduction. This will sound familiar. We already talked about the structure of research and of papers already. It's going to also be the structure of your paper for this class. So an empirical article, it's going to start off with research question. So in that first paragraph, there's going to be a statement about the general research question or questions of the study. And then it's going to become a little bit more focused. The focus starts off with the literature review. And so the literature review is just what we talked about. The literature review is previous articles, especially empirical articles that looked at that research question. And in that literature review, the author of the article that you're reading will be focusing on the things that we just talked about. They'll be looking at some conceptual theoretical arguments about why those variables are connected or related. And they'll also review the findings of previous research. And then the introduction will end with a statement of the specific hypotheses for the study. So the introduction is really important for you to read because it will tell you a lot about previous research. It will tell you about previous findings related to your research questions, which is important, but most important, it will tell you about those theoretical arguments about how and why the variables are related. And then the second part of the empirical article, it will be the method section. It will be labeled method. That's very specific. It's specifically how the data were collected. So who were the people that the data were collected from? What sort of research design did they have? What sort of measures they had for the different variables that they're looking at in their study? So it'll be those specific things. So what I'll say is, for this class, do read the method section, but if you don't understand some small little technical details, don't worry about it. Just get the general gist of it. Then the third part of an empirical article is the results. It will be labeled results. That will be the statistical findings of the study. So the statistics will be run there. For this class, I'll say it's not super duper important to understand everything in the statistics part. But still, you took statistics and you're going to be doing statistics for your paper, so it probably would pay off to read some of those things. At the very least, it will serve as a model that you'll be using for your own paper. But some of the statistics that are in articles might be a little bit more complex than you learned in your first statistics class that you had before this class, Social Science 10. So if you don't understand some things, don't worry about that. And then the last part of an empirical article is the discussion section. That is really important to read. The discussion section will be, in essence, the interpretation of the data. So what do the data mean? And so in the discussion section, you'll see it will start off relatively specific. It will summarize the findings regarding the hypotheses. So were the hypotheses supported or not supported by the statistics? And then the meat of the discussion section is, okay, given these statistical findings, what does it mean in terms of the conceptual issues that were raised in the introduction? So there'll be more discussion about those conceptual issues. In relationship to the study's data, did it show that there's this connection between these variables and what's responsible for those connections? And this is a very important part for you to read to help develop your own arguments for your own paper. And then the discussion has some discussion of limitations of the research, but good researchers don't dwell on that too much. They acknowledge it, but they don't sit there and kvetch about it all the time. And then the last part of the discussion section looks forward, so makes suggestions for future research. So if you remember the process of research that we looked at early in this lecture, is that a specific study doesn't stop there. It says, okay, how does this specific study, help inform the larger research literature on this question? And so it often is in the form of suggesting future research questions to look at to make an extension from that study. So again, pay a lot of attention to the introduction and the discussion when you're reading empirical articles for your lit review. Get a general sense of the methods, but don't worry if you don't know the little details. The results, I would read it for a model and just sort of get your statistics abilities back up again. But again, if you don't know some of the technical stuff there, if there's more complex statistics than you were taught in Social Science 10, don't worry about it. So empirical articles are probably going to be the most common thing that you're going to be reading for your lit review. Also, if you're lucky, you can find a review article. What I mean by a review article, it's somebody who is interested in that broad research question, and they go ahead and they read a bunch of the research that has been done on that question, and they summarize it. So that's why I say qualitative review. So they read those articles and they're trying to give a summary, a narrative written summary of those articles. Those can be extremely useful to find because that person has done a lot of work. So you might look for a lit review, for example, or research review in your search terms for your annotative bibliography. But if you don't find one, don't worry. They're not necessarily super common. And then also a nice thing is that not only have they sort of summarized a lot of the research for you, but also it can give you a lot of references that you can look up, so other studies you can read. So review articles can be really useful, but they can be sometimes rare. You might also read some theoretical articles, probably not a lot, but maybe one or two. A theoretical article is one that is, just like it says, it's theoretical. It might refer to previous research, but the whole focus of the article is talking about those conceptual links, those theoretical links between the variables. That the article is not reporting a study that had collected data. So there's no data analyses. There's no interpretation of data. It's just simply conceptual arguments about how things are related. And then a fourth type of article that you might be reading for your bibliography, which these are really rare, and they might be a little bit difficult for you to understand, but if you find them, it might be useful. It's what's called a meta-analysis. It's kind of the flip side of the review article. So remember, in a review article, somebody goes and finds a bunch of studies that were conducted on that research question that they're interested in, and they read it, and then based on their reading, they try to summarize it in words. So it's more qualitative in its review. Meta-analysis is the flip side of that. It's similar because the author goes and finds all of this research that has been published about this topic previously. But in this case, what they do is they look at the quantitative aspects of it, the actual data. So they're going to be looking at the actual data from the studies and actual statistics from the studies. And using this thing called meta-analysis, they're going to actually have numbers. There's going to be mathematical analyses about the overall findings of all these different studies. So if you find something like that, it might be a little bit more difficult to understand the technical things, but it also may have some decent things in the introduction and the discussion for you to take away in terms of conceptual arguments. And again, the reference section could have a lot of studies that might be useful for you to look up. So these are the basic types of studies. There's other types that kind of fall between the cracks, but these are the basic types of studies that you might encounter as you are reviewing your literature for your research paper. Just to talk a little bit about the process of what does it mean by peer-reviewed. So you'll notice that in your bibliography and for this paper, you should have peer-reviewed sources. So what does that mean? For one, it means not some stupid stuff from the internet. So don't get some sort of internet site like psychology.org or something like that and cite that. That's not a peer-reviewed source. So we want a peer-reviewed source. And that means that other researchers have examined the article. It doesn't have to be research, it could be any types of these articles. Any of these types of articles would go through a peer review process for a journal. So other researchers who kind of know the topic review the submission, what's called a manuscript, sort of the draft of the paper, and they comment on it. And so typically what happens is that there's an editor for the journal. There's many sub-editors, but an editor or a co-editor or a junior editor will get the manuscript, the paper, based on the topic. So these topics go to you, and so the editor looks at it. Typically what the editor will do is not make too much of a judgment. They'll kind of look at the topic of it, and then they'll select reviewers. So they'll select 3 reviewers, typically 3 reviewers who they kind of have in their database. So they have a database of different reviewers and their expertise. And the review is what's called double-blind. What does that mean? That means that the person who wrote the article will not know your identity. So they won't say, oh, Kevin Carlson said your article sucks and it shouldn't be published. That doesn't happen. It will say things like reviewer 1 commented that, and then also vice versa. So the reviewer doesn't know the author's name. So the author's name is removed from the manuscript when you receive it. But sometimes if it's a really famous person and they're really well known in the area, sometimes you can kind of tell who they are. Based on their writing and their topic. Sometimes you can kind of tell who they are if they disclose too much in their method section, like if they say it's a large public university in Minnesota. There's really probably just one large public university in Minnesota, so you can probably know who it is. So it's probably not perfect, but still, when you're a reviewer, you shouldn't know who wrote the article, and even if you kind of have a sense of it, you should ignore that. You should review the article based on what's written, not about the person's reputation. And then what you do as a reviewer is you read the article and then you write your comments. And so reviewers differ a little bit. Some reviewers are very micro. They might correct grammar and spelling and go sentence by sentence. Other reviewers are more sort of global and holistic in the review and go section by section. The introduction is good, but in the middle part there's not a good explanation about how the variables are connected, things like that. And so as a reviewer, you write up your comments. Usually they're like little bullet points, and it's usually a page or 2 of comments. And then you give an overall decision. So each reviewer makes a overall decision, and basically there's publish, yes, this is so fantastic, publish it right away. That's very rare. That rarely happens. There is a decision of publish with revisions. I would say that rarely happens on the first submission. Usually it happens with the second submission, so when somebody has actually done some revisions, and you say, okay, this article is pretty good, but there's some things they need to correct, and what you do is the editor will say, we will publish this if you correct the following 5 things, and they'll specify those revisions. A very common decision is resubmit. So that means that you've read it and it sounds like an interesting question. They did a fairly decent job in their methodology, but there's not enough there. There's some major thing that's lacking. So typically, as a reviewer, what you do is you say something like, "Oh, this research is really interesting, and I found these points to be really valid, and this was well done, but there was these shortcomings, and because of these shortcomings, I advise that they should resubmit, take this back, do the revisions based on the reviewers' comments, and resubmit the manuscript." If that happens, by the way, usually what the editor does is that the editor tries to find the same reviewers. So if you have a journal article that you're a reviewer and you're asking them to resubmit it, when they do resubmit it, you oftentimes get the revision, the revised version, and then you're asked to make that decision. Usually the decision is yes or no. Typically you don't say, oh, resubmit this again, because it's like, okay, if you haven't done your revisions well enough, it's going to be a no. If you did your revisions well enough, it's going to be published or published with some small revisions. And then the other decision, which is relatively common, is basically no thank you. We read this and it looks okay, but it really is not good enough for this journal. It's actually not good enough that we're going to ask you not to bring this back to us, and good luck with it. Good luck finding another journal to submit this to. And then what the editor does is that the editor compiles those 3 reviewers' comments and decisions, and then they make a final decision based on those comments. And then the editor's job is to summarize the overall gist of the reviewers. Now what happens is that the author sees all the letters, so the top letter will be from the editor. So it'll be the editor's decision and the summary of the editor's impression, strongly based on the reviewer's comments. And then also the author will see all 3 letters from each reviewer. So the authors will see all of this stuff. So that's what peer-reviewed means. So peer-reviewed process is a pretty rigorous process. So that's why we want peer-reviewed journals and articles for your lit review, because those are things that can be sort of trusted. They've been vetted to be of high quality, or at least of decent quality to be published. And if you remember the first lecture when we talked about science and pseudoscience, this is a big thing in terms of having that thick skin. So remember, you should be open to criticism. Because sometimes you'll get reviewers that are really tough on you, and you just got to take it. You can't say, oh, they're just full of crap, I'm not going to listen to them. You can't do that. You have to take it. Sometimes when the author, they've read the reviewer's comments and they're asked to, what happens is that when you're asked to revise it and resubmit it, you're actually allowed to make comments on things. So typically what you'll do is you'll address the criticisms and the comments through the revisions. But there are some times where you think this reviewer is really they're off, or they maybe misunderstood something. So you can write in your letter back to the editor when you resubmit something like, I've addressed all the concerns of the reviewers except for the following, and then you can actually in bullet points say, reviewer number 2 said this, and I I appreciate their perspective, however, I don't agree with it. It doesn't fit with this research. So you're actually allowed to make a rational argument about why that criticism doesn't fit. But the editor does not take that out in terms of just they believe you. They have to. The editors will look at that and they'll think rationally whether that is a rational argument. So you do have to be thick-skinned and you have to be prepared to sort of make your arguments when you're a scientist. Also, you have to be very thick-skinned because sometimes you'll get that no thank you. You'll work for a year and a half on something. You'll submit it to a journal and they'll say, thanks but no thanks. See you later. And you gotta pick your you gotta kind of take that punch in the stomach and pick yourself up. Sometimes it's a matter of just saying, okay, I just need to make this better. I need to make the paper better, and then find a new outlet. So you have to be pretty tough mentally to be a scientist. But that's what science is. Science is not saying that you're right just because you're right. Is you should have good arguments for your position and data that back it up. So sorry about going on with that, but I think that's a key thing to learn from this class is you're not just learning research methods and statistics, you're actually learning a perspective on life to be tough-skinned. Just because somebody doesn't agree with you doesn't mean that it's the end of the world. It challenges your beliefs, and maybe you need to rethink about your data. Maybe your data actually says something different than you thought, and you need to listen to that different perspective. Or if you think that the data really says this, is have that rational argument with data that back you up. It's not about a belief that I believe this and I feel so emotional about it, it must be right. No, it's not. There's something outside of me. There's some sort of objective evidence outside of me that I can look and say, okay, this kind of backs up this position and it makes sense rationally. It's not about me, it's about the evidence. And I think that's something that is needed in our country at this point in time, is that type of a perspective. So we talked about articles, so let's talk about books a little bit. You might use books as part of your lit review. I'll say probably less so because a good book is sometimes hard to find and sometimes books are a little bit general or vague. But if you find a good scholarly book, you can use that. And by scholarly books, they go through similar processes of sort of peer review. So there's some rigor to it. And these are through academic publishers, not popular publishers. And so scholarly books, sometimes there's one author or two authors, and they write a whole book. That's relatively rare these days. It happens sometimes, but that takes a long time, and they have to be experts. And so sometimes you get an author or two that write the whole book. But what is probably more common in psychology is that we have these things called edited volumes. So there'll be an edited volumes on some topic, and there'll be different chapters by different authors. So let's say that I want to be an editor on a book about personality disorders. So I think, this would be really great to have new perspectives on personality disorders. And so what I'll do is the editors, I'll find experts in each of the personality disorders and ask them to write a chapter. Oftentimes those chapters are kind of close to what they've already written in published articles, so it's a matter of them just sort of summarizing their research and what they know about the topic. And so that will be an edited volume where you have different chapters with different experts on different parts of the broader topic. And those things can be useful if you find them. But I would say don't spend a lot of time trying to find those things. Sometimes when you find those things and you read them, they're not great sometimes. So do focus more on the articles. But scholarly books are possible. So we already talked about generating research questions. So we aren't going to do this activity, but we're going to summarize the activity because you've already generated some research questions in lab exercise 1. So we talked about research questions being a statement about the relationship between variables. And when you start digging into the research question and you start asking about that research question, it starts raising some interesting questions that we should be answering in our lit review. Things like, what are the possible causes of this characteristic? So if I'm interested in narcissism, what causes narcissism? If I say narcissists are more aggressive than non-narcissists, well, are there certain situations where this occurs more often? And the answer is actually yes, under ego threat. So they've done experiments, and so basically when a narcissist doesn't have their ego threatened, so basically they think they're right. They're not aggressive. They're actually they can seem quite nice when everybody's kind of kissing their butt, essentially. But when their ego is threatened, they become very aggressive. And how they did this in the research is that they set up an experimental condition. They had what they call false feedback. So a false feedback condition is you have somebody do something. Let's say that it's solving a maze. So here's a maze, and I want to time you, and then so the person solves the maze, and you time them. And the false feedback is you're not going to give them any accurate feedback, except you'll tell them the time because they kind of know the time. So you took 2 minutes and 35 seconds. So the false feedback is regardless of the time that the person did it in, half the people you tell them, wow, you're faster than 80% of the people. You're in the top 20%. For the other half of the people, regardless of their time, regardless of their real performance, you tell them, maybe not quite like this, I'll be a bit exaggerated. You'll say something like, oof, you're dumb. Oof. 80% of the people who did this task did better than you. You're in the lower 20%. So it's called false feedback. So when you have a narcissist and you tell them they're smart, guess what? They're not going to be aggressive because their ego is not threatened. In fact, you've kind of piled on to their facade that they're great. When their ego is threatened, that's when they become aggressive. And in this particular study I'm referring to, the aggression was measured by shocks. So they had a competitive game, and they're able to shock their competitor, and so they measured the intensity of the shock. So the person could set the intensity in terms of the voltage, and then the person could also measured duration. So you push the button down, and so they measured how long the person pushed the button down. And so narcissists who had their ego threatened, they gave much more intense shocks, and they pressed the button down longer to administer those shocks. So sometimes our research questions lead to things about, is there certain situations that this happens? And again, this can come out in your literature review. Or it could come out in observations. So if you've known narcissists, they can seem very charming at first. Everything's fine. They look good. They're warm. They seem warm. They're outgoing. They seem friendly. But two things. If you need them, they're out the door, right? They don't want to spend any time helping you. So if you need them, they're out the door. Sort of like the dismissing attachment that we talked about in the previous video. So we can see narcissism come up there, and then also we can see narcissism in that threatened ego. They're what we call fragile. There's another word for it. I can't think of it at the moment. Brittle. So just any little suggestion that they're wrong sets them off. They're very brittle people. So sometimes when we make those observations, we can think, okay, we can't see narcissism if everybody feels happy and good. We have to think about situations that will provoke and will bring out the narcissistic behavior. Sometimes we ask the question, what's the possible effects of some sort of behavior or characteristic? So if somebody is narcissistic, what would their romantic relationships look like? What would their work relationships look like? What would they look like over time? So a classic study of narcissists over time is that they look pretty good when they're in their 20s and 30s. They're still narcissistic and they think they can conquer the world. But for most narcissists, they won't be able to achieve the great things that they think they're going to achieve. And so when they're in their 40s and 50s, they start becoming riddled with more psychological and health problems because they haven't achieved the greatness that they thought they would. So you can kind of think about these effects over time. That could be a research question. Again, we can sort of talk about what types of persons exhibit something more or less, or more reactive to a stimulus. So oftentimes in experiments, they manipulate something and they think, well, this manipulation of the thing will change people's behavior. And that might be true overall, but there might be people who are especially reactive. So I guess a tip of the cap to my stats students that are now in this class. In stats class, I use this example a lot because it's pretty simple. So we could look at literature about whether color affects attraction. And there's a decent amount of literature that wearing the color red, especially for women, will lead to them being perceived as being more attractive by other people versus other colors. So in the experiments, they will contrast the red with green, let's say, or blue, or both. And some of the arguments about that is evolutionarily, red has been a sign of sexual availability and fertility and things like that. And then culturally, there's some cultures that have red as a sign of passion and things like that. So if you think about Valentine's Day, you think of red, right? If I say Valentine's, you think red. You don't think blue or green. So there's also some sort of cultural aspects to this too. And in my stats class, I talk about the possibility that maybe people differ in their reaction to red. So there's this psychological construct of sociosexuality, which is basically is somebody a dog or not. This is insulting dogs, I guess. So somebody really sexual or not. So somebody who's high on social sexuality thinks about sex a lot, sees sex everywhere, thinks about sex, is obsessed with sex, might look at pornography a lot, that type of thing. And somebody who's low on social sexuality is not so concerned about sex, doesn't think about sex much, isn't obsessed with it, doesn't sort of perceive that in normal everyday social situations. So people differ on this. And so I don't know if there's been any research on this, but my speculation is that people who are high on social sexuality probably react more strongly to red. So while there's a general increase in attraction for red for people, probably people who are obsessed with sex, think about sex, who are very reactive to sex, probably the color of red is going to be especially attractive to them. And probably people who are low on social sexuality, the color red's probably not going to have a huge impact on them. So sometimes when we do experiments, we also want to measure some sort of personality characteristic or something else that could influence people's reaction to that stimulus. So part of this research question thing is not just sort of taking the research question broadly, but thinking a little bit more specifically, when does it apply? When does it happen? What provokes this? And do people differ in their reactions to these things? So when you set your research questions, there's different ways of evaluating it. There's sort of two things, which I don't know if these things are diametrically opposed per se, but they kind of tend to be a little bit. Is it interesting and is it feasible? So how do we gauge interesting? Well, sometimes it's that gut feeling. Sometimes you'll hear about a research question and you go, ugh, okay, you're doing that. Okay, do it. It sounds kind of boring. So sometimes there's that gut reaction. And what I'll say is, trust your gut reaction. In this class, I want you to choose things that you're interested in. So if you chose a research question in lab exercise 1 just because it seemed easy, you're going to probably be pretty bored with it, is my guess. Another way to gauge interestingness is not just sort of the gut feeling, but is the answer in doubt? So is it something that we don't know about, we're unsure about? So that makes it more interesting. It's more interesting if it fills a gap in theory or the research literature. So I mentioned earlier in, I think it was lecture 1, in psychology, because it takes us a long time to do psychology studies, we don't want to just simply replicate the same study over and over again. How boring would that be? We want to have that nomological network where we're addressing the same larger question, but we're asking smaller questions underneath it, measuring it in different ways, using different research methodologies, different designs, experiments, self-reports, observations. And so this thing about the gaps is that when we're doing research questions, you just don't want to necessarily ask the same thing somebody already has found out so much about. If your study is looking at a research question that we have so much data on already, it's a waste of time. I'm not talking about this class. In this class, don't worry about that. You're not going to be publishing your studies in a major journal or anything like that. But for real researchers, you don't want to just reinvent the wheel. That would be a waste of time. So a really good research question is one that talks about something that there's a hole or a gap in existing literature. Nobody has addressed this specific thing. We don't know about this. Let's look at it. And also interestingness sometimes is gauged a little bit more objectively, whether it is important for a practical issue. So would the study help in some sort of practical issue? We talked about therapy, for example, in another video. So if my research is going to inform us pretty specifically about whether certain techniques are effective with people with PTSD, that could be a very interesting question because that has important practical implications for people and for therapists. So whether it's interesting is one component of evaluating, and the other one is feasibility. So yes, we want an interesting question, but it also has to be feasible. What does that mean? We can actually do it. We can actually answer the research question. So a lot of this could be in two ways. A lot of this could be scientifically. So can I actually measure that thing? So I mentioned earlier in lecture 1 about love. So if you say something like, does how much somebody loves somebody predict divorce rates? Well, guess what? Yes, you can measure divorce rates pretty easily because you can just go to the government agencies and you can actually find out who's divorced. So all this stuff is public records. And you can find out how many people got married. It takes a while, but you can do it. It's pretty easy. But you can't measure how much somebody loves somebody. There's no way to measure that. Also, it's scientifically uninteresting because different people can love people to the same extent, but they have qualitative differences in their attachment. They're preoccupied or they're dismissing, insecure. Those differences, those qualitative differences in attachment tells us a lot more about relationship outcomes than pretending that we can measure the amount of love. So I'd say that would be an example of a question that is not scientifically answerable. We can't measure that. Also, another part of the feasibility aspect is resources. So do you have enough time to answer this question? Do you have money? Do you have assistants that will help you? So when you're planning out your research questions and your research projects, that's a very important thing to think about. And so for us, for example, being a summer class and being an online class where we don't meet in person, and so if we're not meeting in person, it's very hard to do group work. And so summertime, hard to do group work. My nightmare would be we would try to do groups and the groups don't meet. You end up doing crappy projects. People are stressed out. People can't collect their data. It turns into a big mess. So part of my evaluation of that is that that's not feasible for us. So given our time and the online environment, what makes more sense is to do your research projects based on data that have been already collected. So we take out that major part of it so we don't have to worry about it. And then we can design, you can design your own studies and lab exercises where you don't collect your data. So oftentimes when you plan researches, you want to think about those things. And I think our class is an example of that. In terms of feasibility, in terms of major research projects, it's a long process. Again, ours is pretty modest. It's just a small project that you're going to be doing for class to learn about research. But we want you to think more deeply about things, but in general, it would not be published. Sometimes people can present their research at conferences from this type of class, but this will be difficult this semester probably just because of the situation that we're in. But for sort of real research projects, they take a long time. I would say that a quick research project might be 6 months. I can't even imagine doing one in 6 months. If you're an experimentalist, maybe. So if you're an experimentalist who runs small little experiments, it might take you 6 months, but oftentimes it takes a lot longer. So you have to read the literature. You have to get your design done. You have to get IRB approval, which we'll talk about in a little bit, I think, next week with research ethics. So IRB is Institutional Review Board. So once you have your research set, you just can't go out and collect data. You actually have to have somebody review your methodology to make sure it's ethical. That can be quick sometimes. The quickest can be like 2 weeks. Other times it could take 6 weeks to do that. Then of course you have to collect your data. That's probably the most time-consuming thing in psychology. The only exceptions are if you do some sort of like online surveys, but even then that can take a while to wait for people to find your surveys and to take it. And then you have to analyze your data. You have to interpret it. You have to write it up. Usually I'd say that process is probably at least a year. And then if you think about the things that you're going to be reading, the journals that are out there, it can take 6 months to 12 months or more to get something in a journal. I don't really like that. I wish we had more of an open system where people could just post their research and people could criticize it and evaluate it, and it could be sort of an active thing. That would be better for science, but the truth is that a lot of people's jobs depend on getting things in peer-reviewed journals, so they have to go through that process. So the things that you're reading in a journal, even if it just came out now, it's probably something that was done a year and a half, 2 years ago. So it tends to be a long process. In terms of feasibility, oftentimes you have to get money from grants. There's a lot of money from the federal government, but that takes time. So if you want a federal grant, typically that will take at least 6 months, if not a year. So there's a call for federal grants, and people usually take 3 months or more to do their submission, their proposal for the grant. It takes 2 to 3 months to review those things, and maybe another 2 or 3 months for the money to get funneled in. And so it can take a long time to get some major research going because of the grants. In terms of feasibility, if you do longitudinal research, this is something that's special that you need to think about. So longitudinal research is you're following the same people over time. So as part of my graduate work, I did analyses, actually secondary data analyses from a longitudinal project. The people started having data collected on them when they were 3 years old. And actually, by the way, I was 3 years old, roughly, when this project started. So obviously, I didn't have any say in these data because it started when I was a kid, too. So they followed the same people from 3 to 4, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, 15, 18, 23. So you follow the same people over a long period of time. If you do that type of stuff, in terms of feasibility, you need to be very careful about your data measurements. So for most studies, they do very specific data measurements. They measure specific variables. And they publish the research, within a year or two, and that's fine. The problem with longitudinal research is that concepts fade. So what's a hot concept right now, nobody might care about it in 20 years. So if you're doing longitudinal research, you can't do it saying, I'm going to focus on these 2 or 3 specific things, because in 20 or 30 years, maybe nobody cares about those 2 or 3 specific things. And so when you're doing longitudinal data collection and research, you want flexible data that are broad, that can be looked at from different perspectives. And actually, if you're doing the attachment data set for your research project, and if you're going to be looking at variables related to personality, actually the personality measure is from the longitudinal research that I used as a graduate student. What it is basically it's a list of 100 personality characteristics, but it just says it's a measure of personality characteristics. It doesn't say it's a measure of narcissism or a measure of anxiety. It doesn't say that. It just has a bunch of things that are related to personality, and then over time, people can look at specific things from that. You can measure narcissism in it. You can measure anxiety in it. You can measure personality disorders in it. You can measure depression in it. So it's flexible enough that you can actually measure different constructs over time. So feasibility, longitudinal research has some special things that you need to think about. Also, in terms of feasibility, there's often this question about, should I develop my own measures and methods, or should I take somebody else's? So this is a really big question. So my own experience as a new researcher was sort of like, I want to do things my way. But when I was doing and actually I did, for my dissertation I had some of that. But I remember that one of my committee members who was a full professor, and he's a chair professor now at Berkeley. He looked me in the eye and he said, Kevin, it takes 5 years to validate a new measure. So he was always like, I know you really want to be excited about this stuff, but it takes a long time to develop a new measure. So a lot of times people use existing methods and existing measures. There's nothing wrong with that. If somebody has published a measure and it's been validated, it relates to something in a good way, it seems like it's measuring the construct, it has some evidence, so there's some value to using existing measures. So there's some validation of it already. It's also obviously faster. So somebody has already taken those 5 years or more to validate that measure. You don't have to do it. The problem with using existing measures, of course, is that it's not exactly what you want to do. So sometimes when you're using those existing measures, you're like, oh, I hate this question. I hate this other question. But you can't take a question out. You got to keep it all in there. So you kind of have to take the good with the bad, if you will, with existing measures. You can develop your own measures, a new measure. It takes more time. It certainly takes more time to validate it. And depending on the measure, it can take a long time. So I've done two major measures at least. One measure is the trans identity development questionnaire that was reviewed in the data sets. And if you're doing that data set, you'll see a little bit more. I actually developed that, and actually it was kind of interesting how that happened. So there is a major researcher looking at trans identity development at Yale, and that person had done a lot of qualitative stuff. And I can't remember if they said this in the article or whether I just emailed them cold. And I emailed them and I said, hey, I really like your research, and I want to do this research. However, I don't have the resources to do all these interviews that you do. I don't know if I said it that way, but he's at Yale. He has like 1,000 people in his lab. So they do these interviews, these in-depth interviews. I can't do that. So I said, well, these interviews are great, but I'm wondering if you've ever developed a questionnaire for the same thing. And he wrote me back and said, yes, I am currently developing the questionnaire, but it's not ready to be shared. And I thanked them, but underneath I said, screw you, I'm going to make my own and make it better. So I ended up making my own. That took, because I actually had some collaborators, some graduate students there. That took, I would say it took at least 6 months to construct, if not longer, if not 9 to 12 months. So it took a little bit of time to do that, and that was a fast one. The other one I developed took a lot longer, which was a Q set. A Q set is just like what I talked about with personality, where you have individual items measuring something. And so in this case, it was a Q set measuring a romantic attachment interview. So an interview that measured whether people were more secure, preoccupied, dismissing. And it was a pretty complex measure because it has to do with interview stuff. So you have to watch an interview and code these things. Constructing that Q set took, the initial one took probably 12 months and took another 12 months to validate. So at least 2 years to kind of feel good about it. And then I revisited it when I was at Scripps College and did some revisions on it. And that took another sort of 3 months. So there was at least 2 years and 3 months to get to a point where I felt like it was pretty strong. So it takes time to make these measures. So you see here in the bottom, I said that you'll get some experience in doing this. Obviously, you're not going to be taking a long time to doing things, but we're going to have a lab exercise where you're going to construct a questionnaire of your own. And so you'll get some experience in constructing a questionnaire. And I think that experience is going to be very useful because as a psychology major, as a psychology graduate, when you go out to the real world, you might have a boss who says, you were a psych major, I want to do a survey of our customers or a questionnaire, you do it. So probably of all the things that we're going to be learning in this class, in terms of methods, measures, questionnaire surveys are going to be the most likely thing that you're going to be asked to do in the future. So let's get some practice in doing that later in the semester. So just to summarize, we're in the first part of the research process. So we actually have the research questions that you're thinking of, but we're going to be having you review the literature and thinking about the theory behind that research question. Why are those things connected? How are they connected? And then you're going to generate more specific hypotheses. And that, by the way, is your introduction. Your first part of your paper. So we kind of went over this. I'm not going to go over everything again, but obviously the theory is very important. You want to be able to explain the connection between your variables. So those explanations, we call them structures, processes, organizing principles, all that kind is the same. So why is this thing causing this other variable to change? And for a major theory, and you're not going to necessarily be writing a major theory, of course, in this class. That's a bigger thing. But when we talk about theory, it's an interrelated and coherent set of ideas. So it's a pretty grand thing. And again, you're not going to be doing that. However, you're going to hopefully be reading some articles that are referring to theory that has been developed by other people. Again, theory is important because it's the hows and whys. Without the theory, the data are meaningless. You can have fantastically collected data, but if you can't say what they mean, if those data can't discuss or can't be used to discuss how are these things connected, why does narcissism relate to aggression, then they're meaningless. There's no meaning to the data if you don't have these things. And then the last part of your introduction, and we'll get to this later on, you're not doing this yet, so don't worry, but we're talking about hypotheses. So hypotheses are specific predictions. And what's nice about this class is I can say refer to your statistics class. So in your statistics class, for every stat that you ran, you should have had a null hypothesis that you're testing with the stats, and then you had an alternative hypothesis. Those null and alternative hypotheses specified the relationship between the variables. So that's what we mean by hypotheses. Again, this is derived from theory and also from previous research. So after you've done your lit review, you should have a more specific sense of your specific hypotheses. And again, you're going to use different sources for deriving a hypothesis. It can come straight from theory, so the theory says this. You might derive a hypothesis from part of a theory that's untested. And a really sort of complex hypothesis, which you probably won't do for this class because it is very complex, is distinguishing between competing theories. So what does that mean? So when we distinguish between competing theories, a good example is one where we can think of attachment versus temperament. So attachment says that children act in certain ways because of the responsiveness of the parents. So if the parent is responsive, the baby's more secure, more confident, more balanced emotionally. And by responsiveness means responding to the baby's needs. So the baby cries and wants to be fed, you feed the baby. The baby cries because it's scared, you pick up the baby. The baby pushes you away and says, hey, leave me alone, I want to go play. You leave the baby alone, let the baby play. So your responsiveness to the needs of the baby. Parents who are what's called intermittently responsive, so sometimes they're responsive to the baby's needs and sometimes not, tend to have preoccupied kids or anxious kids. And usually they're intermittently responsive because it's based on the person's needs. So usually anxious infants have anxious parents. And so if you've ever been around people who are anxious, sometimes they're with you and they're very caring, but other times they're just so caught up in their own anxieties that they almost don't see you, they're so caught up in their own stuff. Same thing for the parents there. So sometimes they're responsive, sometimes they're not, because they're kind of caught up in their own stuff sometimes. And then the argument is that one of the reasons why the babies are more anxious is because they found out that they get payoff sometimes. So they're like little gamblers. They know if they push the button 50 times, they'll get at least five times it will pay off. So that payoff of 5 times is worth enough to push the button 50 times. So you might actually have seen this with your romantic partners if you have had anxious romantic partners. So anxious romantic partners, they push that button a lot, right? Do you still love me? Do you still love me? Do you still love me? They're all over you. And sometimes they get the payoff, right? Sometimes you respond to them well and they like it. Other times you're like, hey, leave me alone. But that 5 times out of 50, it's worth it for them. And then parents who are unresponsive or aggressive in their responses to the infants tend to have infants who are dismissing or avoidant. So kids who are avoidant oftentimes have parents who do kind of several things. So the baby cries, the parent might hit the kid, shut up. Or the parent might yell at the kid, just sort of, yeah, shut up, enough. Or the parent might say, I can't take this, and they'll leave the room. All of those things are not good for the baby, obviously. I'm not talking about emotional, I'm just talking about survival. Survival needs, probably not good things to have. So what happens with infants who face that type of environment is they become avoidant. They cut off their displays of crying. So if I don't cry, I'm not going to get hit. I'm not going to get yelled at. The parent's not going to leave. So the parent is kind of around. Maybe it's not the best situation, but it's the best situation given this environment. And again, the baby doesn't think this, of course, but there's a system in the baby that reacts in ways that will be beneficial to survival. And what happens is when they measure this stuff in babies, they do this thing called strain situation, which you may have had in some of your courses. And so when they do a strain situation, I think I'll concentrate on the avoidant because that's really where the competing theories come into play. So when you do the strain situation, what you do is you have a parent bring the baby in. It's a strange room. It's a lab room. But it's a lab room that's nice because there's carpet and there's all these toys the baby can play. Usually what happens is the parent walks into the room and the baby sees all the toys and asks to be put down. They play with the toys. There's 2 chairs. The parent usually sits in one of the chairs and then while the baby's playing. And then what happens is that experimenter comes in the room. So they knock, knock, knock. The experimenter comes in and the baby looks, and usually the baby looks at the parent because they do what's called social referencing. So should I worry about this person or not? And then the experimenter sits in the chair and talks with the parent. And so the baby gets the message that this is a good person. They don't need to worry about them. So that's the setup, and now we start torturing the babies. And so I never did this research. I don't think I could do this research. It would be too heart-wrenching for me to do. So what happens is that the parent, and the lab person instructs the parent what to do. The parent gets up and says, see you later, baby, and leaves the room alone with the stranger. And this happens when the baby is 12 to 18 months old. So what do most babies do in a situation? Obviously, they cry. They're distressed by the parent leaving. That's not the important thing. The important thing is what happens when the parent comes back. So the parent comes back, and usually there's a knock. So the parent knocks, and the parent comes in. By the way, when the parent comes in, the lab assistant slips out of the room without really the baby knowing oftentimes. And what they look at reunion behaviors. So does the baby make eye contact? Does the baby ask to be picked up? Is the baby comforted by the parent's return? Does the baby go back to playing with the toys in a sort of a systematic, focused way? So you look at these reunion behaviors, and then there's a second episode, by the way. So there's another episode where they torture the baby further, and then the parent again gets up, says, bye, baby. They leave. In this case, they leave the baby alone. There's nobody in there. Then the baby cries, of course. And then what happens after a couple minutes, there's a knock on the door. The baby thinks, what? The baby thinks it's the parent. Nope, it's not. It's the lab assistant. And then, usually the lab assistant's not very helpful. The baby's still distressed. And then the parent comes back. And they do the same thing. They code for the same types of reunion behaviors. So with avoidant babies, they look calm. They can cry, but what happens is that they kind of are detached. They don't make a lot of eye contact with the parent. They might not be asked to be picked up with the parent, and they do this thing what's called distracted play. So they will play with objects, but the play is not really good. It's not focused. The baby's not concentrating on it. It's what we call empty play. I can also call it distracted play. So you might know people when they have some distress, the way that they deal with it is they try to distract themselves from it. If you think about an avoidant or dismissing romantic partner, you might be crying and upset about something, and they're reading a magazine upside down. They're obviously not reading the magazine; they're just trying to avoid you. I've heard a lot of times this can be manifested with video games. So you're breaking down; they're just kind of emptily playing the video game. It's a way to distract themselves away from that emotion because they can't deal with emotions well. So when they had this initial research, there were some people who were temperament researchers, and temperament is kind of the opposite. You are the way you are because you're born that way. So just kind of put it simply, temperament is you're born that way. Attachment says you kind of become this way because of your relationship with your parents and how responsive they were to your needs. There's more to it than that, but that's the basic distinction. So there's competing theories. So when those things came out in the initial research, or temperament researcher says those babies are not avoidant, they're just independent. They were born independent. They're just strong, independent babies. Don't say they're avoidant. So what happened is that they had some follow-up research, and there's multiple research studies that have done this with adults and kids. But the first study that happened basically was, okay, let's examine this. So the competing theories was that you're born this way, you're independent, or you're actually anxious, but you cut off crying and those anxiety displays because you had bad consequences from doing that from your parents. So the researchers thought, well, how can we distinguish these competing theories? And the way to distinguish it is through heart rate. So what they did is they did the same research method, but they hooked the babies up to heart rate monitors. So if these are super strong, autonomous, independent babies, they should be just as calm in terms of their heartbeat as they are outside, right? If the attachment theory is more correct, even though they look calm on the outside, there should be an emotional storm going on inside. I shouldn't say emotional storm, that's more of an interpretation, but there should be physiological arousal showing distress. So they did a study, and guess what they found? They found that the attachment was more correct in this situation. So they looked at the heart rates, and the avoidant baby's heart rates increased a lot when the parent came back. Parent comes back, woof, heart rate goes up. This was despite on the surface, facially and in terms of their behavior, they look calm. They look calm, but there was that storm underneath. So this definitely went on the side of attachment and against temperament, because if temperament was right, these should be calm babies inside. Their heart rate should be super calm. So that's a good example of competing theories. So by the way, that's kind of the origins of narcissism too, since we've been talking about narcissism quite a bit here in class, is you feel that vulnerability underneath, but to cover it up, you have that calm, strong facade. And actually what they demonstrated in research is those babies who were avoidant when they were 12, 18 months old, when you look at them at age 6, they're little narcissists already. They think they're perfect. Nothing's wrong with them. They're fantastic. They're smart. They don't have any flaws. Well, it shows that facade. Underneath, there's all that vulnerability, but to guard against that, I'm going to pretend I'm perfect. Nothing's wrong with me. Nothing's wrong here. So again, that example, I kind of like to elaborate to sort of say what research means, but those are the competing theories of temperament and attachment. Okay. Already talked about that, so here we go. And then in terms of this same sort of picture of doing research, we can talk about this as being the hypodeductive method. What does that mean? So you generate your hypotheses, you collect data to test those hypotheses, you use the statistical results from those data to make conclusions about the theory. Those conclusions about the theory go back into the larger theory, research literature, and leads to either revision or verification of parts of the theory. I'm pretty sure you're fairly familiar with that. So it's that same sort of process. And so we talked about this already, so I'm not going to summarize this whole slide because we've talked about it, but what I'll just emphasize is when you're doing your annotated bibliography, read it to find those theoretical and conceptual arguments, because that will be the core of your paper. It'll be the core of your introduction. It'll be the core of your discussion. And it'll be the most points for your paper because, quite frankly, the method section and the results sections are kind of mechanical. You need to do those, and you need to do them well, but they're mechanical. They're just special techniques. You follow the process and procedures, things will be fine. But in the introduction and discussion is really where you come out. Your ideas, your arguments, your perspectives, your interpretations. Those are the most important things in research. And so those theoretical ideas from your annotated bibliography will be the core of your paper. So I know I've said this quite a bit, but I want to really emphasize that because that will be the basis of your paper. We already talked about good hypotheses have that rot thing. They're reliable, objective, testable. And in terms of science in general, we want it to be falsifiable. What does that mean? Is that your hypothesis, there's a chance that they'll be wrong. I shouldn't say be wrong, but that you won't find supporting evidence for it. And Karl Popper, who is big in the philosophy of science, talked about that. To really do science, there's a possibility that you'll be wrong, that there'll be disconfirming evidence. And this is why I say that, at least from the perspective I was taught, is that you don't want to say that something was proven in science, because you can never prove something. You've just failed to confirm it, basically. So if you reject your null hypothesis, you've failed to disconfirm it. So it means that there's some evidence, perhaps, that what you say, your alternative hypothesis, is correct, but it's not proof of it. And if you think about your statistics, too, is your statistics are probability statements, at least in terms of your inferential statistics. So if you reject the HO, you're saying, if you're using a P of 0.05 or alpha of 0.05, there's less than a 5% chance that that difference, that effect that you found, is due to just sampling error. That there's really something there. But it's a probability statement. There's never a time that you'll say that P is less than 0.000. There's no such thing. There's always a possibility you're going to make a type 1 error. Your hypothesis should be logical, so it should come from theory and it should come from the hows and whys. So it's deductive. So hypodeductive means that you go from general to specific. You go from the general theory to specific hypotheses. And then you test those hypotheses very specifically with specific data. That's what deduction is, going from general to specific. And also, a good hypothesis is positive, saying that there's a relationship. A hypothesis that says nothing's going on, there's no effect, there's no relationship, doesn't make any sense. Why would you do research to say nothing's going on? So hypotheses should be positive in the sense that it specifies some sort of relationship between variables. And in our statistical test, we evaluate the null hypothesis. By the way, I'm throwing out these stats terms. If these stat terms are not making a lot of sense to you, you should probably review your stats notes from when you took it previously. And also when we're designing a research study, we need to think about how do we define our variables, because the definition of our variables will lead to measurement of those variables. And there's a difference between quantitative and qualitative research. Qualitative research doesn't have to do with numbers. It has to do with sort of what we call narrative descriptions or thick descriptions. So the data are actually words that describe things. In this class, we're going to focus in on quantitative research. Things that have numbers, things that we can analyze with statistics. And also part of our design when we're doing quantitative data has to do with levels of measurement. So are you measuring your variable in a nominal fashion, ordinal fashion, interval fashion, or ratio? Again, if those things don't make sense, please review your stats notes. So when we think about our variables, we have to move from the conceptual to measurement. And how do we do that? We do this by operationally defining things. So we have to define our variable. And this definition will guide us in terms of how we can measure things. And by the way, we'll be doing this later in the semester when we do a lab exercise where you construct your questionnaire. So where do we get this definition from? So we use previous theory and research. But what I'll say is, even if you have previous theory and research, you should sort of spell it out for yourself when you're doing a research study. So here's an example of narcissism. So narcissism does have like a one sentence definition, but if I'm going to study narcissism, I should think about what does narcissism mean on many levels. So I'm not going to read all of this, but you can read it, obviously. So here I just kind of brainstorm, what do narcissists look like? So some of this is from theory. Some of this is from seeing narcissists in the real world. So when you're doing your operational definition of your variables, you're thinking about all the different ways you can see it. Why do we want to do that? Because that tells us about how we want to measure it. And it doesn't actually matter what research design you have, because you'll still be using this type of thing. So if I have a questionnaire, a self-report, I better have questions that ask questions about all of these different aspects. That's what's called domain coverage. So I better ask about all of these different aspects so that I get the domain coverage, I get the full picture of what a narcissist is. So I would write questions based on each of these bullet points. And I probably would generate multiple questions for each. Let's say I was doing an observer report, whether that observer report was from natural observations or from a lab. Have somebody do a task and have some expert watch them and rate their narcissism. It could also be for informants. So if I want to ask other people to rate somebody else on narcissism, I can also use this. I'll generate observational questions from each of these aspects of narcissism. So again, I'm getting that domain coverage. So when you're designing measures, you want to cover the full conceptual definition of the variable. Just here's more examples. So if I wanted to measure secure attachment, I need to think about different ways that secure attachment shows up. So secure attachment are the people, and this is more about romantic attachment. So in adults, secure attachment are the people that are good to be in relationships with. They have balanced emotions. They understand their emotions well. They understand your emotions. They communicate well. They are interdependent, so they have a good sense of themselves, but they can be involved in the relationship also. So this is actually a very brief thing. There's probably a lot more bullet points. But also, if you do like interview research, they are what we call on the bottom here coherent. So one way that we measure attachment in interviews is that we have 5 adjectives that we have them give to describe their partner or their relationship. So as part of the interview, we literally say that. Give me 5 adjectives that describe your partner or your relationship with your partner. And this is why, you remember earlier I said love doesn't really matter, because everybody says love. So I don't care if somebody says they love somebody. It doesn't mean anything. Everybody says that. So they might say love, caring. They may even say things like hateful or deceitful or something like that. So it could also be negative. We don't care about the adjectives they use. We care about what follows up. So after they give the 5 adjectives, we go through each of the adjectives and ask them to give a specific example from the relationship that illustrates that. So you said loving as your first adjective. Can you give me a specific time, a specific episode in your relationship that shows that loving? You said caring for your second adjective. Can you give me a specific episode, a specific time where that caring was shown? So this is what we call levels of memory, because the adjectives are what we call semantic. They're general. Loving, caring, deceitful. Those are general descriptions. The second part of that, where we ask for specific episodes, is called episodic memory. So specific instances, specific times, specific places, specific things that happen. And for secure people, there's a coherence between those. When you listen to their descriptions of episodes that are illustrating the different adjectives, just sitting there and listening to them, you say, oh, that makes sense. Yes, that was loving. Yes, that was caring. Yes, that was deceitful. So we don't care about whether it's good or bad descriptions, the adjectives, the semantic part. We care about whether those things match with the episodic memory. And also, we care about whether it's specific. So secure people will give specific times, specific instances. And typically, when you are talking to somebody who's secure, and you may have observed this in your everyday life too, is in that interview, part of their coherence is also seen as they have some perspective on past events. So there might be something that made them sad or made them angry. So when they're talking about it now in the interview, you can tell that even though they still feel a little bit of that emotion, they've been able to step back and analyze and think about it a bit. So there's a bit more of a perspective. So again, this is not going into the methodology per se about attachment, but this shows you that when you think about attachment, it's not just about what they say they are, but also how they talk about relationships, how their memory works in terms of relationships, and how they process their emotions in relationships. So when you think about these variables, you often think about all the different aspects that you can see in the variable. Because if you have a very limited definition of your variable, guess what? Your measure is going to be limited, your data is going to be limited, and probably you're not going to be doing very good research. Preoccupied. So you can read some of these. Obviously, some of these should make a lot of sense for preoccupied or anxious attachment. In terms of the interview, they lack coherency. So remember, I just kind of ended the secure by saying that they have that perspective on things. So even though they might feel a bit sad or angry or upset about something that happened in the past, there's a bit of a perspective there. For somebody who's really, truly preoccupied or anxious, they are experiencing that emotion just like they did in that time. Oh my God, I can't believe this. And you're like, like when you hear something like that, you're like, let it go. Or not maybe not let it go, but this seems weird. This is like, it's happening now. So they don't seem like they processed the emotion. In terms of their other aspects of their interview, they say too much probably, and they're not very organized. So if you know somebody who's preoccupied or anxious, when you talk to them and something's happened with their partner, they'll talk to you for 3 hours and be like, and I can't believe he does it, and he does this, and then and you're kind of listening, and then what sort of strikes you is after 2 or 3 hours, it doesn't change. It's like the same thing. It's like it's not going anywhere. Whereas with like a secure person, if you see them right after something happens, they might be, oh my God, I can't believe he did this and he said that. Oh, but I have to think a little bit more about this. You can kind of see them getting away from the intensity of the emotion and evaluating what actually happened. Did something go wrong here? Why did they act this way? What can I do about this? But with a preoccupied person, they tend to be stuck in that moment. And when you do these interviews, that stuck in the moment, you can see stuckness for years. So they're talking about something that happened 10 years ago, and you're listening to a person, it's like, oh my gosh, they're almost like reliving that experience. It's like hasn't changed. That emotion hasn't changed or hasn't been processed in those 10 years. And in terms of the coherency of the levels of semantic and episodic, is that they tend to give things that don't match, and they tend to have vague things too. So whereas a secure person says, like, let's say deceitful, and oh yeah, my boyfriend, he cheated on me with this woman, pretty specific episode there. With a preoccupied person, they might say something like about hateful or something like that. They usually probably won't say that, but they'll turn to hate. But they'll say things like, he always does this. So, well, you said that you can't trust him. Can you give me an example of not trusting him? Well, he always is out and I don't know what he's doing. Well, no, that's not specific. Can you give me something specific? So whenever I hear somebody say things like, they always do this and they always do that, I'm like, oh boy, that sounds a little bit preoccupied to me. It's also not very good communication. So if you're talking with your partner, the worst thing to say to them is that you always do this. No, they don't always do it. Say things like, when I feel this way and say this, you tend to say things like that, and that makes me feel this way. You want to be more specific. So in terms of the semantic and the episodic, they'll be very general. And also what happens is that there'll be a lack of coherency between matching of the semantic word with the actual episode. And oftentimes it's because that they have what we call undifferentiated emotion, which is up here. You can see in the things here. So a good example of that is, so somebody says loving. So again, I don't care if you say loving, because everybody says loving. Okay, you said loving. Can you give me a specific example that shows that lovingness? And this is a pretty good paraphrase of the actual person's statement. Well, that actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to find that quote. Yeah, sorry about that. I just wanted to get the exact quote rather than trying to paraphrase it. So here's actually the exact quote. So I'm very loving, actually. So very loving because we cared a lot about each other. I mean, through it all, no matter if we were fighting and being vicious towards each other. So by the third sentence, the very loving turns into fighting and being vicious to each other. No matter what, we always knew part of the reason we were acting so strong was we cared about each other so much. And still, I feel like he knows me like nobody else ever will. By the way, whenever I hear somebody say something like that, he knows me in ways that nobody else ever will, or he loves me in ways that nobody else ever will. Well, when I hear that, I'm like, oh boy, probably preoccupied. So the interviewer's thinking this is pretty general, so I need to ask for a more specific memory. No, not really, just and kind of mumbles. Just, I guess, almost invariably, we would have a big fight, and both of us by the end would be in tears. I love you, and this is hard for me, and they tail off into this sort of incomprehensible little girl voice, by the way. It's kind of scary to see. So we can see here that it's general. So the thing that they're talking about is pretty general. There's no real episode here. And also it doesn't really match well. So it has that undifferentiated emotion. So, right away, almost like the third sentence, very loving turns into fighting and being vicious. And then when they're asked for a more specific memory, really quickly here, you can kind of see this in the sentences. So they go from big fight to crying to I love you. So for preoccupied people, there's a sort of mixture of love, hate, anger. And for them, it's all mixed in together. They can't separate it out. It's like a big bowl of boiling water or like a cascading waterfall. You can't separate out the different parts of the water. Secure people, of course, have those same feelings. They love, they hate, are sad. But for a secure person, it's differentiated. So a secure person says, when this person does this, it makes me feel loved. When this happens, I really get angry. When this happens, I feel sad. So same emotions, but they're differentiated. And they have that clarity, whereas the preoccupied person doesn't have that clarity in those emotions. We can kind of see how when we assess things, we want to think about different ways to measure things. And again, the big point of what we're doing here is that your definitions need to capture all of these components of the variable, or else you're going to have really bad measurement of the variable. And let's just round out dismissing, so you can kind of see the parts of dismissing. And the dismissing people are incoherent too, but they don't talk much. So whereas a preoccupied person talks a lot, dismissing people don't talk very much. And I think you can ignore this thing. I'm not going to talk about the amygdala and hippocampus in this class, at least not now. So here's a dismissing person. And again, we have loving. So I don't care if you say you love your partner. It doesn't really matter in terms of science. It might matter for you personally. That's fine. Of course, that matters. Love does matter. But for a scientific standpoint, everybody says love. So it says loving. So give me a specific episode time that shows this. Loving because we're loving. We're loving people. She was very loving, very willing to give emotion and show emotion. So the interviewer says, well, thank you, Webster, for the definition of love, or just repeating love a bunch of times. Can you give me a more specific instance of this? Of course, it doesn't say it with that sarcasm. And so the person says, well, just a big smile and a funny laugh. And certain habits. I don't know quirkiness. So you can see here, they don't say a lot. And certainly what they say is not specific. There's no specific episode here. And what they say is not really matching with love. They're just sort of throwing out things like big smile, funny laugh, certain habits, quirkiness. And they don't say much. So they kind of lack memories. And some people might say, well, they're dismissing, maybe something bad happened in a relationship. Well, what's really interesting about these things is that relationship actually that guy's talking about, for one, he has a very high IQ, something like 150, 160. So it's, verbally he's very capable. And that relationship he's talking about was at least 1 year long, if not longer. And there's absolutely no evidence that anything bad happened in that relationship. So there's no reason to be defensive. Probably there's something about the neural development during childhood that affects this, but we won't talk about that now. So there's a lack of memories. He's not making those connections between the semantic and episodic levels of memory. And what's kind of interesting in terms of methods, when you ask somebody who's dismissing, they say they're secure. But then when you do observer reports or do interviews, that's when you can see they're dismissing. So sometimes when you think about what you want to measure, you might want to ask about, is it best measured by asking the person or by observing the person? And so for something like dismissing attachment, if you ask the person, you're going to get a lot of misinformation because, yes, you're secure people, there's going to be some secure people in it, but there's also going to be some dismissing people in it. So you might want to think sometimes about what's the best way of measuring in your research. You can do this activity. I don't know if I'm not going to enforce this activity. If you want to do it, you can think about defining aggression. What ways can you define aggression in ways that cover the broad scope of that variable? I think we're towards the end here, so I know it's been a bit of a long lecture, but we're really covering some core concepts for the class. So you might remember this from statistics. So when we do research, we make this distinction between the population and sample. So population is the group of people that you're trying to make generalizations about, and then a sample is the subset of people from that population that you use in your study, or that you collect data from. And then in statistics, we talked about descriptive and inferential statistics. So descriptive statistics describes the sample. So those are your things like your mean or standard deviation. It describes the sample or describes subsets of the sample. And we know means and standard deviations. We know there's actually a number. We can add those things, divide by the number of people. We know what the average is. Then we have inferential statistics. Inferential statistics are using the data that you collected from your sample to make inferences about the population. So that's where the p-values come into play. So looking at my data, it says there's a difference between narcissist and not narcissist on aggression. And my p-value is less than 0.05. So if I did this study many times with a sample size like this, at least 95% of the time I would find a difference between those two groups, narcissist and not narcissist. So there's a high probability that there is a difference between those groups. So inferential statistics are making those generalizations about the population, about your general research question based on your sample's data. And those statements are always probability statements. We can never say for sure. And in terms of population and sample, remember the distinction between representativeness. I should say the distinction. Remember the concept of representativeness. So representative means that your sample represents your population. So whatever components and aspects of diversity that are in your population, those things are also seen in your sample. And obviously, the more representative your sample is of your population, the better your research is. If your sample doesn't represent your population well, then even if you do your inferential statistics, logically that generalization from your sample to your population is iffy because your sample doesn't look like your population. So how do we get a representative sample? So we can do simple random sampling. So you should have had this in your stats class, but just as a quick review. So simple random sampling means that everybody in the population has an equal chance of being in the sample. Everybody in the population has an equal chance of being in the sample. If you have a large enough sample and you select it randomly, generally speaking, that sample should represent the population. Again, that representativeness increases as the sample size increases. If you have a small sample, let's say you have a sample of 10, and you say my population is Chaffey College students, even if I randomly sample 10 students, probably 10 students won't represent the full diversity at Chaffey. I probably need a sample of maybe 50, 100, 200 people. You can also do stratified random sampling. So there you take some, and it's impossible to do everything, but you'll take some aspects of diversity or differences in your population, and you'll make sure that it's represented in a sample. So let's say that you have the percentage of ethnic identity of Chaffey College students and certain percentages for different ethnic identities. What you do in stratified random sampling is that you take everybody who's identified for those different identities, and within that identity, you randomly sample people. And your final sample will have the same percentage. So whatever percentage of ethnic identities that Chaffey College has, your sample will have those same percentages. And to select people from what we call those strata, you randomly sample people from those different strata. But the percentages are determined by the percentages in the population. So when you do something like that, it's a little bit more sophisticated and you get a little better representation in your sample because you've systematically made sure that there's certain aspects that you feel are important to represent that diversity in, and you made sure that you represent that diversity in your sample. And then the worst thing you can do is convenient sampling, although a lot of psychology does this. Convenient sample is grabbing who's ever there. So, for example, at four-year schools, there's often this thing, what they call a participant or a subject pool. So everybody who's in intro psych, they're in the subject pool. And so all these researchers who are doing research, I think not all of them, but significant number of researchers who are using college students as their samples will get people from the subject pool, the participant pool. So they're not random sample. They're not a random sample of college students. They're not a random sample of human beings. They're a convenient sample. They're there and available. So a lot of times psychology uses the convenient sampling. And some of that is the nature of our research. Oftentimes our research, we want to generalize to people in general. Can you randomly sample from people in general around the world? No, you can't. That'd be extremely expensive. So oftentimes we rely on convenient sampling. Also, one thing we want to cover in terms of just basic research stuff is research design. Experimental versus non-experimental. Sometimes people call non-experimental research correlational. I don't like that. There's a bias in psychology, which is of course sort of an experimental bias. If you don't do experiments, you're not doing good research. I think that's nonsense because of something I want to talk about in a second. So if we're talking about an experiment has a true IV, independent variable. So it's something that you manipulate. So if I want to see if red increases attraction in people, I'm going to manipulate that. So let's say I have two groups. One group is going to see somebody in red and rate their attractiveness. And then a second group is going to see somebody, the same person, same picture, I'll just change the color of what they're wearing to blue. So I am systematically manipulating whether you see red or blue. And if my study is well conducted, if the average attraction rating for the red group is greater than that for the blue group, then there's some evidence that red causes more attraction. So that's a true IV, where we're manipulating something to see if it changes the outcome, the DV, dependent variable. Obviously, non-experimental research does not have a true IV. Why I don't like the bias for experimental research is because there are a bunch of things that you can't manipulate. I can't manipulate parenting behavior. I can't tell parents to do this thing or that thing systematically and manipulate that as an IV. That's unethical. Personality, I can't change your personality. It's both probably unethical and unfeasible to change your personality. So there are some really important research questions that we can't manipulate the variables. So to me, experimental and non-experimental research are on the same level. We shouldn't think one is better than the other. With experimental research, there's an argument that we can make more cause and effect attributions. So if you do non-experimental research, you're basically observing something that occurs in the real world. So you can't manipulate things. And so because you can't manipulate things, you're not controlling things in the real world. I'm not controlling parents how they behave to their children. They would say that there's so many variables, it's hard to say what's causing the kid's behavior, let's say. So experimentalists will say that they can only say things about cause and effect because they have the true IV, and if I show one group the red, I show one group the blue, I act the same towards both of the groups. The only thing that varies is the blue or red that they see. If there's an attraction difference between red and blue, it's because of the color. Also, you can see that there's the order there. I present the color and then I get the attraction. So because there's that time sequence, color, attraction, then I can talk about causal effects. So you see the color first, it affects your attraction towards that person. Because of that time difference, that sequence, that order, there's cause and effect. Also in experiments, we want to make sure we have experimental controls. So the only thing that is differing is our color in that case. So you want to train your researchers. So the researcher should not act differently whether you're seeing red or blue. If they act differently, then that can actually make you act differently. So it's not the color that's making you have more or less attraction, it's the person doing the research because they're acting differently and they're giving you cues about what to do. So as long as you have a experimental control, the only thing that's varying between the red group and the blue group is the color, then we can talk about cause and effect. The worst thing is if we have a confound. A confound is an extraneous variable, but a very specific one. It varies systematically with the IV. A good example of that is what we call expectation effects. So the person who's conducting the researcher has an expectation that people are going to act differently depending on the level of the IV. So if I'm doing the red and blue experiment, for example, if my experimenters are acting differently towards the people who see red, like they're acting more friendly, or they're like kind of like, hey, here's a picture of somebody, and if they're, the blue, like, oh, here's a picture of somebody. If they're acting differently like that, oh my gosh, that's a confound. You're acting systematically different to the red group and the blue group. And that's going to mess up your cause and effect. You might say, oh my gosh, red's so much higher, it's the color. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's because your experimental was acting so different to the red people versus the blue people. So we have to be very careful that the experimenter doesn't convey these expectation effects to the participants. So we already talked about this. Non-experimental means that we don't have a true IV. We're not manipulating something. Typically, we're not manipulating because it's not possible or it's not ethical. I like to use the term predictor variable. So if it's something that you're not manipulating, but you're looking at the effect of that thing on some sort of outcome, your DV, we call that a predictor variable. And just sort of thinking about this cause and effect argument that's made by experimentalists, it's a bit overblown. I think there's a danger because in experiments, oftentimes they manipulate just one variable. And there's a big danger there because you're manipulating that one variable and you say, oh, there's a difference in the DV, and then you go out running and say, oh my gosh, this thing changed its behavior so much. The problem with that is that that's not the real world. In the real world, there's multiple variables that are influencing our behavior every second. So yes, it's a nice experiment and you can show that there's some statistical relationship, but we can't forget that that variable in the real world isn't in isolation. So it's something what we call is, I call it reification. So if you say, oh my gosh, this variable in my experiment says so much, we have to be very careful about reifying it and saying that that's the only thing. It's not the only thing. It's maybe one of the things in the puzzle, but we can't forget that there's a more complex mixture of other things in the real world. Also, we want to look at the bulk of evidence. So yes, you can't necessarily say there's this big cause and effect in non-experimental research, but if you have all of these studies that look at the correlation between, let's say, parenting, responsiveness in infancy, and infant attachment, well, we have, 10,000 studies or more that says this, maybe there is something going on. So yes, we don't have a cause and effect thing because we can't manipulate systematically parenting behavior. That's unethical. But there's so much research out there that there seems to be a causal connection. Also, longitudinal research. So a lot of longitudinal research obviously is non-experimental, because how can you do an experiment over 20 years? So when you do longitudinal research, you're looking at the patterns of how somebody develops. So for example, I published a study on narcissism, and I looked at these kids. This is the data I was talking about earlier. So I looked at the data from age 3, specifically personality data. These personality data were collected from preschool teachers. So preschool teachers rated each kid's personality, and there were several teachers. So it wasn't just one teacher, it was several teachers that did each kid. Those observations of the kid's personality at age 3 predicted to a decent extent whether they would become narcissists at age 23. So yes, it wasn't an experiment. I did not manipulate anything. However, I found these patterns that showed some sort of links between how they looked at age 3 and what they turned out at age 23. There's probably some cause and effect there. So yes, maybe the cause and effect is not so tight because I was looking over 20 years, but there's something there. So my big point here is there is a bias in psychology towards experiments, and oftentimes it's this cause and effect argument. But if we think about it more completely, that argument is not conveying the full nature of things. So when we think about research, we need to think a bit more complexly about it and not just sort of have these biases that are often presented in textbooks and perhaps in some of your classes. There's also a distinction between lab research and field research. So this distinction, I want to kind of check where we are in terms of the slides. We're almost done. So the big thing in terms of lab research versus field research. So if you do research in a lab, there's usually a lot more internal validity. What does internal validity? It's related to that control we talked about, that experimental control. So if I'm doing something in the lab, I can control things, right? I control how much light there is. I can control the tables that are there, the furniture that is there, what happens in my lab. I control everything. So lab research is oftentimes what we say has high internal validity. I'm controlling everything. And if I'm doing an experiment, I can pretty much make sure that only the IV is differing. Everything else is the same for everybody. Field research, where we're actually going out to the real world, it often lacks internal validity because we can't control the real world, right? So if we go and observe people in a coffee shop, we can't control things. There's so many things that are happening, we don't know what's happening even. But it has what we call higher external validity. So high external validity means that it's more realistic. It's how people actually behave in the real world. So sometimes there's this argument that there's a payoff. So if you do your research in a lab, yes, you can have a lot of control, a lot of internal validity, but maybe it's really kind of a strange place. It's so strange that we're not quite sure if we can generalize how people act in that lab to the real world because it's such a strange situation we put people in. So there's usually that trade-off, and vice versa. There's that trade-off between external and internal for field. So yeah, we're watching people in the real world, but so much stuff is happening. It's really messy. It's hard to say exactly what's causing their behavior. So typically there's this trade-off between the two. There are some exceptions. So sometimes people can do what's called field experiments. So field experiments are conducted in the field, but you manipulate an IV. Just to give you an example of this is, will people throw away trash or will they put it on the ground? So there was a researcher at UC Santa Cruz, and what he did basically is, I don't know if this happens much nowadays, but these flyers. So like if there's a flyer for a party or a bar or something, they'll go up to the university and they'll put all these flyers on everybody's windshields. And so it's a pretty natural situation. So what this researcher did is this researcher put a bunch of flyers out on windshields. And what they had is they had a true IV. What they had was a model. So they had a model who would go to their car. So they would look they'd watch for somebody to come towards their car, and they'd have the experimenter's person go out and kind of go in front of them. And they would go to a car, and sort of in front of the person, they would do one of two things. Either they would pick up the thing from the windshield and throw it on the ground and discuss, I'm sick of these things. Or they would pick it up and they would crumple it and put it into the recycling bin or into the trash can. So they controlled that. So there was a true IV. Throw it on the ground or throw it in the proper place. So they did this, and what they did is they watched whether the participant, who didn't know they were in the study, by the way, followed the model. And you can imagine, yes, they did. So if they saw somebody throw it on the ground, they were much more likely to throw it on the ground. If they saw somebody throw it in the trash can, they were much more likely to throw it in the trash can. So this is a real-world experiment, a very natural, it's not just a very natural, it's a natural setting, a very realistic situation of having a flyer there. And the person actually didn't know they were in the study. I think they debriefed them afterwards. So they probably came up to him and said, hey, we watched you and recorded what you, and this is what we did. So you usually want to debrief people, but you don't always have to do that. So that's an example of a field experiment. It's in the real world. There's a true IV. So it kind of has the best of both worlds. It has both internal and external validity. So obviously, when we're talking about the research method, the scientific method, we test our hypotheses with our stats. We talked about descriptive versus inferential already. So these should look familiar to you. If these terms don't look familiar, you should probably look at your stats notes and do some refresher on that. And your statistics don't really matter if you don't make some sort of conclusions from this. So what do your statistics mean? So it's not just about the numbers, but what do the numbers mean? And basically, we know that just one study does not confirm a theory. So we already know that there's no proof in a study, so you can't say we prove this. We might get some evidence and some support for the theory, but we can't say we prove the theory. Definitely one study doesn't do that. What we want is we want multiple research studies done by multiple researchers, done in multiple places of the world, using different research methods, experimental, non-experimental, using different methodologies, self-report, questionnaires, observational methods, informants, all sorts of different methodologies. And their findings say roughly the same thing about the research question. So why does not, so, that's what a nomological network is. We talked about that before. So why is it that one study doesn't prove something or confirm a theory? Well, we have type 1 errors. So type 1 error is where we reject the HO and say there's an effect, but there really isn't an effect. When we set our alpha at 0.05, what we're saying is that we're willing to live with a 5% chance that we'll make a type 1 error. So there's always a possibility when we're making a type 1 error. Also, there might be other theories that predict the same relationship. So that statistical relationship that we found between the two variables, there might be another theory out there that explains it. So we can't just sort of say this statistical relationship supports just one theory. We want to look at other possible explanations. And if obviously other studies that look at this research question, it might not support the theory. So again, we want to look at multiple studies done by multiple people using different methods because it's really that bulk of evidence that tells us whether a theory is worthwhile or not. I already said this too, so there is scientific evidence, but there's no scientific proof. So in science, we never think we have the final answer. We never think that we have proof for something. We just look for more evidence and better explanations, but we know we never have that final answer. And that's a core thing about the scientific method. We already talked about this, so in the process of research, we want to publish your findings, you want to make it public, you want to put it up to criticism, you want other people to see it so that they can incorporate it into their research. So things like peer-reviewed journals, book chapters, or conferences. So at conferences, typically there's two things you can do. You can have a paper and a panel. So if you have a paper, typically there's people who have done similar types of research issues, and they present as a panel about that research issue. But another way you can do is you can do posters. So you summarize your study in a poster, and people walk by and they read it. And actually, that final thing is what you're going to be doing for class. So as your final projects, you're going to have your paper, but also as your final product of your research project, you're going to do a video presentation of a poster. And we'll get into the posters later in the semester, but we'll actually have you practice doing a conference presentation in this class. And that's it. So I know this was a bit of a long lecture, but we covered a lot of important concepts. And again, if you haven't done it already, you're in control. You can take breaks when you want to when you're watching these videos. So take care, and I will talk to you in the next lecture.